Today on the Tinker and Geek, I'm going to show off my CN RS-3 in O scale. This model I found years ago at a flea market from a vendor that actually usually sold like estate, N-scale, and HO scale model railroad equipment. He'd originally had it hoping somebody might want it as like a mantelpiece or something like that. At the time it wasn't in running condition and it had a really bad orange and black CN paint job. This model had actually started life as a Western and Maryland locomotive that somebody had painted over with black, and looks like they had brush painted the ends with orange paint and given it the CN orange and black paint scheme, but it was in pretty rough shape when I got it. You know, there was overspray white on the trucks, the paint job wasn't very good, the decals were all peeling, and I'm sure that whoever the original modeler was very well intentioned, but even when they'd put on the CN logo decals on the locomotive, they'd actually carved into the body around the logo, cutting the decal out. So I had some work ahead of me. So at the time I was a member of an O-scale club in London, the London Model Railroad Group. And anybody that's had a look, O-scale locomotives are quite expensive. Even at the time I believe that the smallest locomotive started about $250. Which was out of my budget at the time. So I was really quite happy to find this for much cheaper, even if it needed some work. One of my colleagues at the club helped me get it running and actually gave me a number of these detail parts, including the winterization hatch and a few other pieces. Managed to get it all up and running. There's some Delrin parts inside that actually had cracked and were causing some issues. So he managed to get it all mechanically sound, and now it runs quite beautifully. Given the opportunity, I also wanted to give a stab at making a much more detailed locomotive. Originally, all of the grab irons and everything were all cast on. As is quite often the problem with RS-3s, they have the American style number boards, which are actually mounted somewhere around here on the side, not on the front on an angle. It didn't have the bell. It was actually missing most of the handrails. Had some of the stanchion parts, but none of them were applied. I also had details like the marker lights. And the grille actually has been replaced. It's hard to see from this angle. I'll show it a little bit more later on. The grill was actually solid grill originally, and it's now a proper mesh grill. The antenna's been added. Of course, the whole thing's been painted, and lighting's been added. So, definitely one of the scariest things to start with was actually removing the cast details. Considering that there was no chance I was going to be able to replace the model, it was very nerve-wracking taking an X-Acto knife to it and carving off pieces of the model. But I was able to actually do it pretty successfully. I was particularly nervous about removing the old number boards, but that actually went better than I expected too. So most of the detail parts added are brass, all the stanchions, the bell, Even the grill are all brass detailed parts. The winterization hatch is actually styrene. That was made by another gentleman for me. All the front details, the MU hoses and such, those are just plastic castings. So I'll show you a little bit about the display stand. I did originally buy it to run on the club layout, but since then I've actually moved across the country and no longer have an O-scale layout to run it on. So I want it to be able to be both a static display piece, but also I didn't want to stop it from being an operating model locomotive. So I made a few adjustments and a few things I'll show you now. So one of the things, the stand actually has a magnetic reed switch, and I have this little bush here with a magnet in it. So if I put it on, then it's getting power, and there's a supercapacitor built inside, which I'll show in a minute, that actually charges up and then keeps everything lit. If I move the bush to the side a little bit, then it turns off the charging and it's just running on battery. This is all done. There's an umbilical right there that connects the locomotive to the base so it can charge. And then if I want to operate that, I can just tuck that up. If it focuses here, I can just tuck that up into the fuel tank. Still didn't focus very well. So that umbilical I can just tuck up into the fuel tank if I want to operate it on the layout, and then it's out of the road. Okay, so now let's take a little bit of a closer look at this thing. So if we flip it over, there's a couple of switches that I've located on here. So this one is for whether it's for static power or the track power. So track power gets it from the trucks, static power gets it from the little umbilical there. Also, you can see right underneath there's another switch. What that does is that actually turns on the classification lights. That was a bit of a technical challenge considering that they were brass castings and originally were not designed for light to go in them. So I had to drill them out, and then there's actually a grain of, I think it's a grain of rice is the smaller one, light bulb in them. And then crystal clear lenses over top to give it that look. I did choose to go with all white because from what I could tell, most of these were run just with white marker lights as extras. So the green and the red wasn't used too often. So we'll see if we can carefully take off the shell here. Did add some screws to the bottom just to help hold it together a little bit better. It had a fair amount of flex in the truck or in the frame, which I didn't like. So this helped sturdy it up. You can see here, this is an old Weaver, and it's actually got a drive shaft through it. There's a tower on this end here, and then it drives both trucks from there. One of the trickiest parts is all of these handrails actually tuck into the cab. Need to be very delicately wiggled loose. Okay, so in here we've got the custom electronics that I created for it. It may look kind of complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. Basically, you've got 2 voltage regulators here. I actually have all the lights connected through stacks of connectors. So we've got separate ones for the running boards, forward and reverse headlights, and then in here, wrapped up in a lot of electrical tape so there's no chance it can short, are the supercapacitors. So if you're not familiar, supercapacitors are, in function, they're somewhere kind of between a small capacity rechargeable battery and a capacitor, or a very high capacity capacitor. So they store charge for a long time. That's especially just running LEDs. You can see that the lights stay lit for quite a while. And the idea was to stop that flicker, and also so the train could be stopped and the lights would still stay on it, just like they do on a regular locomotive. The large resistor is actually because anybody who's a little familiarity with electronics, when a capacitor first starts to charge, it's basically a dead short if it's completely discharged. So the capacitors will pull a tremendous amount of current for charging without that. So a big powerful resistor just sucks up that heat, and it's really only necessary for a very, very small amount of time. You can see it's only 5 ohm. It's basically just to, you know, control the current a little bit so it's just not totally runaway. With any luck, you can see down into the shell a little bit. You can see the marker or the number boards lights mounted in the corners. It's all LED. I managed to find these nice big ones that work just absolutely perfectly for the headlights. And yeah, it's just absolutely ideal. The switches are mounted up in the front there, and that, as I said, controls both the marker lights as well as whether it's charging off the track or off of the display power. Originally, I had no idea which end was forward on these. Turns out these ran long hood forward, so this would be the front end. And this was the case for a lot of the early diesels, and this has been attributed to the fact that steam locomotives had the boiler in front, and so this was the kind of more familiar arrangement with the bulk of the locomotive in front and then the crew cab towards the back. So a couple more things. So first of all, I decided when I was picking the prototype I was basing this off of that it was best to pick a number that I couldn't find a photo of. I'm sure the internet will prove me wrong if there is a photo of 3007 out there, but I couldn't find a photo. Plus, especially over time, as with almost all locomotives, almost no two were the same. So this is a bit of an amalgam of different but there were different horn placements. Some had different arrangements of the bell and marker lights and such. But this is kind of a example of. The keen-eyed Canadian rail fans might also notice that the Canadian RS-3s actually had very different louvers. That's these vents on the side of the locomotive. I thought about trying to replicate those properly, but that just seemed like an awful lot of work. And really, for me, this is a heck of a lot closer than most of the American stand-in models that are out there right now. So one of the last things I'll point out that I did were on the ends here. So a couple of things. So first of all, I added an actual chain. And also the end railings were one of the more challenging things because the American ones are quite different than the Canadian ones. So I was able to actually use the American style ones and cut them up and then solder them back together into this configuration to give it the more prototypical Canadian look. Well, I hope you enjoyed this look at my CN RS-3 in O scale. If you did, please hit that thumbs up button and like. Hit that subscribe to see more content like this. And if there's some interest, I can show some of my other O scale equipment that I have from my days at the Model Railroad Club in London. Also, giving a shout out to them, especially to Bob. Thank you so much for helping me get this thing up and running. And I'll provide a link to their website in the description below. And feel free to get in touch with them if you're in the Southern Ontario area. Also, don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And until next time, keep tinkering.